Hey everybody, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. I want to review the document that came out recently between Catholics and Orthodox from the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. The document is called Synodality and Primacy in the Second Millennium and Today, released from Alexandria on the 7th of June this year, 2023. And so I have had the opportunity to go through the document and I want to review it. You know, it's not terribly long, but it is a little bit long for me to sit here and read the whole document to you and give you my comments on it. That's a little too much. So what I'll do is I'll just comment on select portions of the document and kind of give you an overall impression and overview of it. There's some people who are happy with it. Others are very dissatisfied. There's some people who are alarmed, thinking that it has abandoned Catholic teachings. And, you know, there's others who take a different approach and say, no, that's not the case. So that's what I want to do with this, is just kind of walk through it and see what does it say, what does it not say, what are some pros, what are some cons. But first, a word from our sponsors. Hey, pro-lifers, I want to remind you about realestateforlife.org. If you want to support the pro-life movement at no cost to you in the process of buying a home or selling a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, check out realestateforlife.org for more information. God bless. All right, so let me just kind of give you an overview. You know, I'm gonna pull up my notes here, because what I did is, as I went through the document, like I said, it's not really long, but it's fairly lengthy. I mean, you can read it in one sitting, but again, it's not short enough for me to sit here and read the whole thing on the air to you and give commentary. So what I did do is I just kind of jotted down some notes as I was going along, and I'm just going to kind of read those notes to you. And then maybe we'll look at some key paragraphs in relation to those notes. Let me just kind of give a couple points overall. I will say, ultimately, for better or worse, the document changes nothing. Not only because it's not magisterial, that is, it's not actually an authoritative document in the Catholic Church, or arguably even for the Eastern Orthodox. I'll let them speak for themselves, but certainly from the Catholic perspective, it's not authoritative, it's not magisterial, so it doesn't authoritatively change anything. And even just practically, it doesn't change anything because there's nothing new in it. At the end of the day, frankly, neither side denies its own ecclesiology in the document. Neither side. So the Orthodox aren't coming around and saying, yeah, we were wrong about papal primacy. Or the Catholics, they don't come along and say, we were wrong about Vatican I and papal primacy and papal infallibility. It's just not there. In fact, there are things in it to the contrary, where the positions are just simply reasserted. So the Catholic position is effectively reasserted. And the Orthodox position is effectively reasserted. And so somebody might ask, well, okay, well, what good did this document accomplish if nothing really changed? That's a fair question. I would say, well, first, it's a good gesture. It shows that we, as Catholics and Orthodox, are able to sit down and have discussions and have a dialogue, and that's a good thing. So it's good as far as showing that kind of gesture, that we can get in the same room and be cordial and have discussions with each other about the papacy. And so that's good. That's a win, I guess. It's not a bad thing. And it does re-emphasize the fact that we need primacy and synodality in the church to go hand in hand. So you don't want just the Pope running everything to the exclusion of completely ignoring the bishops of the church. Yeah, that's true, obviously. You don't want to overemphasize primacy in the church. You also don't want to overemphasize synodality or collegiality in the church. That is, the bishops collectively acting together. And in the Catholic Church, when the bishops collectively act together, they can really ultimately only do so universally in union with and in conjunction with the Pope in one way or another, never apart from him. So yeah, you do want that. You do want a healthy balance between primacy and synodality, because that is part of the church's constitution. Christ, when he established the church, he gave us two universal organs from the Catholic perspective, two universal organs in the magisterium being the teaching authority of the church. Two, not just one, two. One being the papacy, so the successor of St. Peter. Another being the College of Bishops. So that's going to be the bishops of the world, either acting in an ecumenical council or acting collectively in union with St. Peter, dispersed throughout the world in their own diocese, but acting collectively. That's what we would call the ordinary and universal magisterium. But those two organs, the College of Bishops and the papacy, although the papacy is also part of the College of Bishops, it's not separate from it, but we can point to two distinct organs there in the magisterium, the papacy and the College of Bishops. And Christ gave it to us for a reason. He didn't give us an ecclesiology that's redundant. He gave us these two organs because they complement each other. And so, yes, you don't want to overemphasize one over the other, even though we do recognize that the Pope is able to teach definitively without the approval of or ratification of the College of Bishops. Whereas the College of Bishops can only teach infallibly or definitively with the consent of the papacy. So I do recognize there is a distinction there. But again, Christ gave us these two organs for a reason, to balance each other, to complement each other. So emphasizing, as the document does, that we need both a primacy and a synodality. You can't have synodality. You can't have the College of Bishops working in a collection of bishops working without a head. You need a primacy there. Otherwise, it's a headless body. But also, you don't want nothing but a head, right? You do need a body. There's some utility in having a body and not just a head, which is why perhaps we as humans aren't just floating heads out there. We actually have a body. It's yeah, we have to have the head that for the body. That's essential, but a head in and of itself is a little silly. So, okay. Is that a good thing that the document accomplishes by emphasizing that? Sure. I think both Catholics and Orthodox can get on board with that and say, yeah, we need both. They need to complement each other. The problem, however, is we already agree that we need that healthy balance. There's nothing new there. The point is, we don't agree on what primacy looks like in the church, how it functions, what is its authority, and same questions for synodality in the College of Bishops. So what is their authority? What can they do? What can they not do? That's kind of where the debate is. We all agree in general that you need a head, you need a primacy. Or at least most of us agree. There are some more that obviously don't agree with that. But your more reasonable Orthodox recognize, yeah, you need primacy. You need a head. And a reasonable Catholic would say, yeah, it's absurd if all you did is just had the Pope and the bishops don't actually govern in their own diocese. They just merely carry out the orders of the Pope. The Pope micromanages every diocese. That's a little absurd too. So a good Catholic is going to recognize, yeah, of course, you're going to have the function of the episcopate, of course, the bishop in his own territory, and even regional councils and synodality and local territories. That makes sense. That's historical. That's very traditional in Catholicism. Yeah, what Catholic who actually knows what they're talking about will dispute that? Yeah, you have some absurd Catholics out there who don't know what they're talking about, and when they hear synodality, they freak out. Those are the ones who are historically ignorant. Those are the ones who have also very poor ecclesiology. I'm talking about the more level-headed and knowledgeable Catholics. Knowledgeable Catholic is going to get on board with synodality, properly understood, because it's part of our ecclesiology. So that's not where the debate is. The debate is the role of the first in the church. What can the Pope do? What can he not do? What can the bishops do apart from the Pope? What can they do with the Pope? Or can they act apart from the Pope? These are all questions that we really need to be hammering down and addressing. Unfortunately, they're not dealt with in the document. So what is really agreed upon here? Nothing new. There's nothing substantially resolved. We still have differences in ecclesiology at the end of the day. It didn't resolve anything, but I guess it's a nice gesture, and it helps reemphasize the fact that, yes, we need to start balancing things out. You don't want to put everything on the papacy. Maybe the Pope shouldn't be selecting every single bishop in the world. Maybe we should return to more traditional forms where that wasn't the case, where the Bishop of Rome wasn't micromanaging all of these things. Sure, we can have that healthy discussion, but the bigger problem right now between Catholics and Orthodox is we have more fundamental differences in ecclesiology right now. And that's going to be, again, papal supremacy. What exactly does that mean? And papal infallibility and questions like that. Did the document resolve those things? No. So what did it ultimately accomplish? It's a nice gesture. It reemphasizes some general principles. Okay, great. I do have some criticisms of the document. I certainly think it has an inadequate explanation of church history, especially concerning the primacy in the church, papal primacy. And not only that, but concessions and agreements that the Orthodox have made about the papacy and papal primacy throughout history. I think it's very poor on that. Now, in fairness, the document is devoted to the second millennium because the first millennium document was already addressed a few years ago, and there are criticisms for that as well. They're focusing on the second millennium, but in the way they're presenting some things about the papacy, it's almost as if you get the impression that it's being presented as if certain views of Catholicism about the papacy are part of the second millennium and came more from the second millennium than they did from the first. And that could be certainly misleading. It never comes out outright and says that, but it just kind of gives you that feel. And if that's true, then actually that would be false. Like if that was the intent behind the document, then it's false. The theologians behind this would be in error because in fact, all of the things that we're talking about here when it comes to the papacy, substantially speaking, are number one, biblical. So they're right there, ground zero in sacred scripture. And then number two, they're there in some of the ecumenical councils that we have in the first millennium that both Catholics and Orthodox accept as ecumenical councils. In the East have made those concessions. So you can't just say, oh, well, this understanding of the papacy just kind of develops with Lateran IV in the second millennium. Not really. As we're going to see you kind of get that impression. Again, they don't just come out and explicitly say that, but it kind of is presented that way. And if that's true, I would say they were certainly historically in error, and they might want to brush up on their church history. With all due respect. Now, maybe some of the people knew that, and they just knew that, well, we can't really talk about that, so we're going to have to come with a way to couch this in a way that both sides can accept. And all right, what did we really accomplish, though, by doing that? I don't know. I don't think we really accomplished anything. So, all right. So let's look at the document itself. So let me share my screen and we'll go over some key parts here. There Not sure what's going on with my screen there. Let me try it again. Okay, you should be able to see it now. Let me zoom in here. It's a little better. Let's go to paragraph 1.3. It says, consequently, a more juridical ecclesiology was developed. The false decretals, 9th century, and the false donation of Constantine, 8th century, which were mistakenly supposed to be authentic, stressed the central figure of the Pope in the Latin Church. The new mendicant orders in the 13th century, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, exempted from episcopal authority, promoted a conception of the papacy as being entrusted with the pastoral care of the whole church. Now, you can kind of read that in multiple ways, but the flavor that I get from that is almost as if it's saying, well, this idea of the Pope being a central figure in the church and having pastoral care over the universal church, and not just his diocese or not even just his patriarchate, but, the whole universal church, that was more something that came about from the false decretals and donation of Constantine. Now, it doesn't say that, right? You could read this in multiple ways, but it just gives that flavor. It just kind of gives that impression. And if that was the intention, I want to say, no, that's wildly false. If that's what's being communicated, wildly false. First of all, the false decretals and donation of Constantine had to have some truth in them for them to actually have been accepted both in the West and in the East, because believe it or not, even the Patriarch of Constantinople was citing the donation of Constantine for his own primacy. So it was obviously accepted, both in East and West. So there had to be some kind of truth to it. Otherwise, people would have just said, this is wildly foreign, and we're rejecting this. And of course, the idea that the Pope would be a central figure in one sense and have pastoral care over the whole flock, this has been embraced by multiple ecumenical councils in the first millennium. We just can't deny that. Ephesus, Constantinople, Chalcedon, Constantinople III, Nicaea II. This is not something that can be denied. If you're going to be faithful to the ecumenical councils and what the East accepted on several occasions, you have to recognize that, and you can't just give the impression as if, this stuff kind of came about from forgeries. No. And in an atmosphere where that's the common claim, I'm not so sure this was phrased in the best way. Again, does the document come out and say that? No, but we're already in an atmosphere where people are trying to make that argument and often make that case that, the papacy just arose from forgeries. Not really. So, probably not phrased in the best way. You can also see this in the next paragraph. After the investiture controversy of the late 11th and 12th centuries, the church engaged in another struggle with the temporal powers for the direction of the Western Christian world. Innocent III consolidated the view of the Pope as the head governing the whole ecclesiastical body. As the successor of St. Peter, the Pope has the fullness of power and a concern for all the churches. Individual bishops will call to share in his solicitude by caring for their own diocese. Well, again, does it just come out and say this idea of the Pope as head of the church is mainly native to Innocent III? No, it doesn't come out and say that. Could somebody read that in that way? Yeah. And do some make that argument? Yeah. So is this really phrased in the best way? Probably not, because the concept that the Pope is head of the church is, for crying out loud, in our ecumenical councils in the first millennium. In fact, in multiple ecumenical councils, you can't deny it. It is explicitly there in Chalcedon, for instance. It's explicitly there. And it's not just Chalcedon. You can't deny it. It's a bad argument to try to oppose that because, again, it's already part of the ecclesiology of the first millennium. It's more importantly biblical in nature. And also the arguments that are kind of used against this concept end up also working against the concept of the bishop being the head of his local diocese. So they tend to be short-sighted, and they kind of come back to bite the Orthodox who would make that argument. So that's another point that I would mention here. Now, if you go to 1.7, it says in the West there were provincial synods, but the popes also convoked general councils, like the 4 Lateran councils, which constituted the reform of the church in the West. Constitution 5 of the 4th Lateran council stated the Roman church, through the Lord's disposition, has a primacy of ordinary power over the churches, and so on. Okay, here's what I would say. Ultimately, I don't have a problem calling some of these ecumenical councils general councils, as long as we make the proper qualifications, which the document does not do, and that could potentially be a problem. Well, what am I talking about? What are the distinctions that I have in mind here? Well, excuse me, let me drink from my sparkling ice here. If by general council you mean that post-schism, that is, after the split between Catholics and Orthodox, which, when was that really definitively? That's a hard one to answer. But somehow when we answer that one, well, the ecumenical councils that happened after that, or at least the ones that Catholics consider ecumenical councils, if we call them general councils, when we do that, we as Catholics cannot downgrade them to something or anything less than the fullness of the College of Bishops operating in a universal function. And that would then mean anything that these councils taught infallibly or definitively, we cannot downgrade to something less than that. Here's why. Christ established the College of Bishops as an essential part of the church's constitution in Matthew 18. That is essential to the church's constitution. You can't lose the College of Bishops. If we are going to say these councils after the schism, again, whenever that is, the councils after the schism are not actually ecumenical councils, and they're really not full acts of the College of Bishops, what does that imply? It either implies that the College of Bishops was impotent for all of this time, which is absurd, because at that point, what use is it? Or it means it was divided and thus no longer existed for that time period, and still until this day, since there still is a separation between Catholics and Orthodox. So that would mean the College of Bishops doesn't actually exist right now. So in other words, you can't have an ecumenical council right now. That would be heretical, because that would be to say something essential to the church's constitution has been lost. And as soon as you say that, you have violated the indefectibility of the church. You violated it. And you've denied something that's essential to ecclesiology. So whenever we speak of general councils for post-schism ecumenical councils, I'm okay with that if all we're doing is we're saying, well, there's a distinction between these kinds of ecumenical councils and the ecumenical councils of the first millennium. And the distinction would be, well, the councils of the first millennium, these ecumenical councils, were when Catholics and Orthodox were united. Although some of them are a little messier than that, but okay. But I get the sentiment. This is when we are united, and some of these are taking place when we're divided. Okay, if that's all we're doing by making that distinction between the first 7 ecumenical councils and then later general councils, as long as we're recognizing that these later general councils are still supreme acts of the magisterium, they're still acts of the College of Bishops, and their definitive teachings are still definitive. They're still infallible. As long as we're doing that, we're fine. I don't care what you call it. You can call it a zipper council for all I care. I don't know. I just thought it's the rant. I don't care. Call it whatever you want. As long as you mean the right thing by it. But if you're now denying the reality of the College of Bishops existing post-schism and acting in these councils and their ability to teach infallibly, yeah, you know what? I can't get on board with that, because that would be heretical. And so we would now have to say Vatican I, Vatican II, Trent. None of these taught infallibly. And yes, Vatican II does have an infallible teaching in Lumen Gentium 21. None of these taught infallibly, and they were all just local teachings and local councils. And I then have to ask, wait, was it the Second Ecumenical Council a local council anyway? 381? That was a local council, but we accept it as ecumenical. Okay. So you already accept a local council as ecumenical. It's called the Second Ecumenical Council, Constantinople I. You already have that. But for some reason, these other, we're downgrading them to local councils, but we don't want to recognize them as ecumenical. Why? Because they're post-schism? Okay, then you're saying that, again, the College of Bishops doesn't exist after the schism. So the College of Bishops isn't essential to the Church's constitution. You see, once you start pulling on that thread, the whole thing falls apart. So I'm a little sensitive when I hear that, the term general councils in these discussions. It's like, because I know some people have tried to downgrade the post-schism ecumenical councils. They've tried to downgrade them as local ecumenical councils, and you can't do that. So I'm a little sensitive to when that term is used, although they don't come out and say, it's a denial of their infallibility or something like that. Okay. There is that point. Let's go to paragraph 113. Let's see what my note is here. Okay, talking about synodality in the East post-schism. During the 14th century, the Hesychast controversy provoked by Barlaam, a monk of Calabria, arose in the East. The monks of Mount Athos delegated St. Gregory Palamas to answer the challenges of Barlaam. During the 14th century, 4 synods in Constantinople defended the distinction between the essence and the uncreated energy of God, developed by St. Gregory Palamas on the basis of the fathers in the church, such as St. Basil, Caesarea, and St. Maximus the Confessor. Now, here's the kicker. These events indicate the continuing practice of synodality in the East. And I would say, yeah, of course. The problem, however, is this was synodality while the emperor was still around. And the reason why I think that's important is what some people will say is, well, these synods in Constantinople ended up being universally binding in Orthodoxy. Now, some Orthodox are going to contest that, whereas others are going to assert that. But for those who assert that these synods in Constantinople ended up being universally binding, they're going to say, see, post-schism, the Orthodox are still able to have universally binding councils, regardless of what you call them. They're still universally binding in nature. And there's a lot that could be said here. First of all, we could contest that claim. Are they in fact universally binding? And then, how are they universally binding? Are they merely universally binding because everyone so happens to agree with it, or because somehow it had authority in and of itself? If it's only because all of the Orthodox ended up agreeing with it, that's not binding in any meaningful way. Just because everybody ends up agreeing with it doesn't mean it had any authority in and of itself. The authority really comes from everybody so happened to agree with it. But in and of itself, it can't compel your conscience to accept it as true. But I would also point out, even if somehow it's universally binding in scope for the Orthodox, and some want to say, see, post-schism, we can still have synods that are universally binding in nature, I would point out that was when the emperor was around. Are you still able to have that in Orthodoxy without the emperor? Unfortunately, I think the answer is no. So you now have to ask a question, was the emperor essential to the Orthodox Church's constitution to have universally binding councils? People are going to say, well, that's absurd because the emperor doesn't exist anymore. So have you lost something essential? So, of course, we're going to have to put primacy somewhere else. And we're going to have to say, well, maybe that primacy is in, the Patriarch of Constantinople. All right. And how's that worked out for you so far? Have there been any universally binding councils in Orthodoxy since then, after the emperor? Some might argue, well, 1672. And I would point out in that case, it's not because you have someone with primacy there at the council, and then you have a college of bishops there in Orthodoxy, and somehow it's binding on everyone in Orthodoxy because all of the right pieces were there. No. If 1672, Jerusalem of 1672 is binding for Orthodox, which again, many Orthodox are going to say, well, plenty of the parts of 1672 are not binding. There's that whole problem. But if for some reason an Orthodox says, yeah, it is binding in and of itself, because you have the first there, the head, Constantinople, and then you have the body. And okay, how come that isn't how Orthodox are accepting it today? Because if you listen to Orthodox, they would say that 1672 is binding, not because you have those features there, but more because it has been accepted. Callistus Ware will say it. It has been accepted to one degree or another by all of the Autocephaly synods. And you'll notice to one degree or another is the caveat. Okay. So to one extent or another, it's binding, but not because it's binding in and of itself, but because it just so happens to be it's something everybody agrees with to one extent or another. Okay, well, in that case, it's consensus that is really authoritative, not the council. And if that's the case, how has that been working out for the Orthodox? Because they don't seem to be able to have much consensus on just about anything. And do we really have to wait several hundred years before we get consensus, before something is settled in the Orthodox Church? Well, it's absurd. So there's all kinds of problems with it. I did find that to be interesting because it says these events indicate the continuing practice of synodality in the East. Okay, but what has that really done for the Orthodox, especially with the emperor no longer being present? I'm not sure it's done much. So I'm not sure it really means anything to say that. Go to paragraph 115, because I could do multiple shows on that one. So we'll just leave it there to move forward. Let's see. On this one, it talks a little bit about Haec Sancta from the Council of Constance. And it says the chaos resulting from the election of 2 and then 3 popes provoked a deep trauma in the Western Church. To resolve the crisis, a general council was convoked in Constance. This council, attended not only by bishops and abbots, but also by representatives of political bodies, developed in its decree Haec Sancta. By the way, you do have laymen who vote in this ecumenical council. Just throwing that one in there. Decree Haec Sancta, the thesis that the highest authority in the church belongs to a general council, understood as an assembly of bishops and secular powers in contradistinction to the authority of the Pope. I don't agree with that interpretation of Haec Sancta, but I know it is something that even some Catholics read it that way, and understandably so, because of the way it's written. There's certainly some things in Haec Sancta that sounds like it's teaching conciliarism. And it says this thesis is known as conciliarism. Conciliarism subverted the canonical role of the primate in the synod and jeopardized the freedom of the church, which I found to be interesting. Comment for some Orthodox to sign off on. Maybe they don't agree with that part, but I don't know. They're evidently saying that form of conciliarism is bad, but I guess their form of conciliarism is different. Tabling that issue, did Haec Sancta really teach conciliarism? I'm not convinced by that yet. I'm open to it. I'm not convinced by that. Ultimately, if it did, I would have to say that isn't binding. But some would point out, but you have popes who are ratifying Haec Sancta and seemingly ratifying it in its entirety, which would then include ratifying conciliarism. Now, some have responded to that, like Francis Sullivan, and said, okay, but it was ratifying it non-definitively. So it was teaching it non-definitively. And so at the worst, this would be an error of the magisterium, but only in its non-infallible teachings, a non-definitive error. Which is possible in the Catholic Church, but I'm not so willing to jump to that conclusion and throw the magisterium under the bus and say, well, it taught error, it just taught it non-definitively, and therefore our ecclesiology is still intact and everything's still good to go. You know, these teachings are protected by infallibility. Rather than going that route, I'm not so quick to do that. I'm still not sold on the idea that Haec Sancta actually, without any qualification, teaches conciliarism. It seems like it's saying that in the case when there's a case of emergency, when it's unclear who the Pope is, the College of Bishops can act, and those who claim to be the Pope would have to submit. Now, again, some might read it differently and say, no, it's teaching conciliarism, because it then wants to say you should have these ecumenical councils every so many years. And so it saw itself as not just functioning in cases of emergency, but as something that is to happen frequently. Perhaps, and perhaps that was the intention of some of the fathers at the council, maybe. But I do want to read this quote to you from Roberto de Mattei that I do find to be interesting and relevant to this discussion, worth pondering. Because ultimately, I don't have any definitive answers here. I'm still open to hearing, solutions. Again, at the end of the day, worst case scenario, it's a non-definitive teaching of an ecumenical council, and those could be, since they're non-definitive, those could be reversed. So one would argue that Vatican I reversed to that, but I'm not so quick to throw it under the bus. He said Eugene IV condemned the heretics of Basel and their diabolical founders of the conciliarism doctrine. But towards Haec Sancta, he held a hesitant stance, Eugene IV, that is, proposing what in modern times might be defined as a hermeneutic of continuity. By the way, Eugene IV is an important figure because he's the one who put forth what? Well, one of the documents of the Council of Florence that teaches papal primacy. Keep that in mind. He affirmed papal primacy. So he's saying that this Pope who affirmed papal primacy at Florence, when he looks at Haec Sancta, he read it with a hermeneutic of continuity. He didn't automatically say Haec Sancta is wrong. He didn't take that position. He didn't take that reading of Haec Sancta. He didn't automatically say Haec Sancta teaches conciliarism, thus wrong. No, he read it in a way with a hermeneutic of continuity that is in continuity with the teachings of the Church on papal primacy. In the decree of September 4th, 1439, Eugene states that the superiority of councils over the Pope, asserted by the Basil Fathers on the basis of Haec Sancta. So the Basil Fathers who were teaching, the Council of Basel, who were teaching conciliarism, were trying to use Haec Sancta from the Council of Constance to back up their heresy of conciliarism. And the Pope is saying, wait. He says, asserted by the Basil Fathers on the basis of Haec Sancta is a bad interpretation given by the Basil Fathers themselves, which de facto is revealed as contrary to the genuine sense of the sacred scriptures, of the Holy Fathers, and of the Council of Constance itself. So he's saying that if you're interpreting the Council of Constance as teaching conciliarism, Eugene IV, Pope Eugene IV is saying you have a bad interpretation of the council. So he didn't agree that Haec Sancta taught conciliarism. Now, again, the question is, how does it not teach conciliarism? Well, I just gave you an example. It's speaking in the context of a case of emergency when it's unclear who the Pope is. That could be one way to resolve it. If that's inadequate, maybe there's other ways to resolve it. But the fact that this Pope did not understand Constance to be absolutely in contradistinction to his presentation of papal primacy, I think is noteworthy. Eugene IV himself ratified the Council of Constance as a whole, So people will point that out and say, well, you have multiple popes who accepted the Council of Constance as a whole, including Haec Sancta. And they'll try to say, well, see, these popes were denying papal primacy and they were teaching conciliarism. Wait, one of those popes who accepted the Council of Constance and Haec Sancta was Eugene IV, who puts forward papal supremacy very clearly at the Council of Constance. So you can't say he denied papal primacy since he's the one putting it forward. And he understood what he was ratifying to be in harmony with papal primacy, which means Constance didn't actually teach conciliarism. That's a bad interpretation of it. So Eugene IV himself ratified the Council of Constance as a whole, and in its decrees excluded any prejudice to the rights, dignity, and preeminence of the Apostolic See, as he writes to his legate. Now, some might say, well, maybe he recognized that it had conciliarism there, and he's just adding this qualification to say, I don't really recognize that part of Haec Sancta. Some people have interpreted it that way, but not really, since he is already saying, and was already saying, that the Basil Fathers had a faulty interpretation of Constance. So he isn't just saying, well, I accept it only in the sense that it doesn't violate the Apostolic See and its rights. In other words, I recognize it teaches conciliarism, I just don't ratify that part. No, it's a little more complex than that, because he says that the Basil Fathers had the wrong interpretation, a bad interpretation of Haec Sancta. So whenever the document here presents Haec Sancta as teaching conciliarism, I'm not so sure. I kind of feel like, are you sure about that? If so, can we account for everything I just brought up here? I think that's important. Okay, let's move on. I will point out 116 mentions conciliarism was condemned at the Fifth Lateran Council and definitively excluded by the teaching of the First Vatican Council. Now, this is noteworthy, very noteworthy. I don't think it's an admission on part of the Orthodox who are signing this to say that they acknowledge that Vatican I was an ecumenical council that could teach infallibly. I don't think the Orthodox are signing off on it in that way. I think they're just agreeing that for the Catholics believe that Vatican I definitively excluded conciliarism. I don't think that they're actually saying, yeah, we agree that it really, they're just saying for Catholics believe it definitively excludes conciliarism. Okay. But that's important because of what we saw earlier whenever we saw the use of the term general council. General council could mean ecumenical council, or somebody might be using that term to somehow downgrade it and mean that the church wasn't actually teaching infallibly in these councils, such as Vatican I. Well, here that works against that interpretation because it recognizes that Vatican I was teaching definitively. So I thought that was noteworthy. So I don't see Catholics here denying that the post-schism ecumenical councils are ecumenical councils and can teach infallibly. They're not denying that. Otherwise, they couldn't have, if they were, they couldn't have said it definitively excluded the teachings, definitively excluded conciliarism at Vatican I. They couldn't have said that if they believed that the post-schism councils, such as Vatican I, are downgraded in such a way that they can't teach infallibly. They could not have said that otherwise. So for anybody who wants to try to read this as saying, oh, they're denying the papacy and they're denying the councils, no, I don't think so. And there's things in the document itself that would work contrary to that interpretation. So I want to point that out. Let's go to paragraph 119. Talks about the Council of Florence. With regard to all the disputed issues, the council stated that that the differences in doctrinal formulation or canonical practice did not affect the unity of faith. The union was signed by the Greeks under pressure of circumstances and was subsequently not received by the Greek church. Now, I call your attention to this paragraph because what you'll often hear from the Orthodox is they reject the Council of Florence, and you'll point out, but wait, you have literally all of the pieces of the puzzle there to say this is an ecumenical council. You got the Pope, you got the Emperor, you got the patriarchal sees. Some Orthodox will contest that and say, well, this see wasn't represented, that see wasn't represented. There's a whole debate there. But some will say, but the patriarchal sees were represented and accepted the council. And so all of the elements that would objectively considered constitute an ecumenical council were present. And so upon what basis do you reject it? Well, one of the responses of the Orthodox is they'll say they were signed under pressure of the circumstances. You know, you got the Turks coming to, you know, they're threatening the Greeks. And so they needed the aid of the Pope, military aid. And the only way they could get the military aid was by signing off on a doctrinal agreement with the Pope. So the pressure of the circumstances drove them to accept this. Okay. All right. But I want to ask, how does that then impact the Fifth Ecumenical Council and its validity as an ecumenical council? Because as I've mentioned on the show before, that one was filled with pressure. The emperor was pressuring all kinds of people there. The emperor effectively dictated the council from top to bottom. And, you know, people who weren't going to go along with it, he just says, okay, you're not going to be a bishop, and put somebody in place who will go along with it. And he forces the Pope to come, even though he didn't actually attend any of the sessions. He forces him to Constantinople, as you know. And so one might point out that the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the bishops were hardly free to disagree. Now, some might maybe are going to challenge that, but I think historically speaking, that's the case. The bishops were hardly free to disagree at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. And if they're hardly free to disagree at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and by the way, if you don't like that council, I can just mention some others, where some of the other ecumenical councils, there was all kinds of imperial pressure. But the Fifth Council certainly comes to mind. Does that somehow mean that the Orthodox or even Catholics could downgrade and thus even reject the Fifth Ecumenical Council because the bishops were under pressure when they made their decisions? I imagine most Orthodox would say absolutely not. I imagine most Orthodox would not be open to discussing reevaluating the Fifth Ecumenical Council as an ecumenical council. Well, okay. All right. But if they're not willing to reevaluate the status of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, but they are willing to reevaluate the Council of Florence, upon what basis? Because both of them had pressure in it, and one might even argue that there's less pressure in the case of Florence than there is the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So I'm just curious how that works, appealing to pressure. I'm not so sure it really helps the Orthodox case. Let's see what else I have here. Oh, the next thing it talks about is the Eastern Catholic churches. So it hits close to home there. So I want to examine that paragraph 2.1. But first, after this message. So Reason and Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from RNT, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help RNT Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to RNT at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support RNT in the show description. God bless. I found this comment in the chat curious. Chris says, whether the statement is authoritative or whether it's ultimately means nothing or not, words matter. Say what you mean and mean what you say. Well, 2 points. Number one, apply that to your own ecumenical councils. I presume you're Catholic. And even if you're not, you're Orthodox or one of the two. I imagine. Maybe you're a Protestant. But if you're a Catholic and you're an Orthodox, apply that to your own councils. I can start naming councils where, yeah, words matter, and sometimes the words that they chose were out of concession and weren't phrased in the best way, and so we had to have more councils afterwards to kind of clean up some of the things that were done there because it wasn't a fully sufficient job. And so, yeah, whether you're Catholic or Orthodox, you can just apply that same advice that you're using here, which I agree with, but apply it to your own councils. Moreover, again, this wasn't a council, it wasn't an act of the magisterium. So your advice would only apply to those theologians who were present. So your admonition would apply to them. Okay. All right. What did we really accomplish? It didn't change anything authoritatively. It didn't change anything for really either of our respective bodies. So your advice would literally only be applicable to the theologians who were involved in the document. Let's go to paragraph 2.1. Two major new developments affected the relationship between synodality and primacy in the 16th and 18th century, the Protestant Reformation, and the unions established between Rome and various Eastern churches. Those are going to be the Eastern Catholics. The rise of Protestantism led to contacts with the East, even hopes for union, at least during the preliminary phase of their encounter, though it further divides the West. The synodality was practiced. Synodality was practiced in the East during this difficult period, and the decisions of several synods held at that time show what were the theological issues separating Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants. The phenomenon of unions was experienced by the Orthodox as a wound and as a threat, as causing further divisions in the East and as a form of proselytism. Now, I understand that some Orthodox interpret the formation of the Eastern Catholic churches in that way, as a wound, as a threat, as causing further divisions in the East. And although I might not necessarily agree, I would point out, but do you not have this exact same phenomenon in Eastern Orthodoxy? How many times have the Orthodox accepted parishes and entire jurisdictions from Catholicism into Orthodoxy? It's a fair question. How many times have they taken Catholic churches by force in some cases? Not all Orthodox, but some Orthodox. How many churches were taken by force in some parts of Eastern Europe that were Catholics? They were Eastern Catholics. Then they were taken by force for the Eastern Orthodox. It's a two-way street is what I'm trying to say. And I don't see the two-way street being mentioned here. I just see it being one-sided here. I notice, seems like the Eastern Catholics were a whipping boy in these discussions. But the sins of the Eastern Orthodox in this area are often overlooked. There was an article that that was written by Father Robert Taft. I'm trying to think of the name of the article. I know I reviewed it on this channel before. But he talks about this. He goes over the question of, all right, the formation of the Eastern Catholic churches may not always have been under the best circumstances, but were they really what some of the Orthodox make them out to be? And then also, how does this work in light of the actions of many Eastern Orthodox and their behavior? It's worth considering, but unfortunately, it wasn't considered in the document. It seems like what I noticed with this document, and this tends to be the case with these dialogues, is there's more criticism offered against the Catholic side than there is the Orthodox side. And I kind of wonder why. Why is that? Why is it that we Catholics are willing to bend over backwards, criticize ourselves extensively for the sake of trying to bring unity with the Orthodox, but it honestly seems like the Orthodox can't lift a finger on their end in some cases, and aren't really willing to do that with their own position. They're not really willing to criticize themselves, and doesn't seem like they're willing to bend over backwards for the sake of unity. It seems like it's always the Catholic side that's having to make concessions, and the Catholic side that's always having to fault itself and apologize for itself, and it just seems imbalanced or unbalanced. Moreover, causing further divisions in the East, I don't know. Some might argue that the Eastern Catholic Church has brought more unity than division. So there's that. Section 2.2. Let's see. This I found interesting and helpful. It does highlight the fact that Catholicism became increasingly centralized after the Reformation, especially in the area of Rome choosing bishops. So that was more of a it was more because of the Protestant Reformation, and so you kind of have this over centralization of things with Rome. And I think we as Catholics could say, yeah, okay, it's understandable how that happened because of the circumstances, but maybe that's not the best model for today. Maybe. It certainly wouldn't be denying anything essential to the papacy to acknowledge that, given that for the vast majority of history, the Pope did not choose bishops and who the bishops were going to be, especially in the East. Let's see. Somebody says perhaps such actions by Orthodox against Catholics weren't mentioned because the major Slavic churches, the Russian church, did not participate in these discussions. I don't know. I don't know what the reason is, but it's something I've noticed and I think needs to be pointed out. Okay, let's go to 2.6. In this one, we have, look at my notes here. Oh, the motives for the formation of the Eastern Catholic churches. I found this interesting. Various unions between Eastern churches and Rome were established between the 16th and 18th centuries. The motives for these unions have always been contested. Genuine desire for the unity of the church cannot be excluded from consideration. So I found that interesting. You know, sometimes you'll hear that some of the Eastern Catholic churches were formed out of political motives, and I would just simply say, okay. The document also notes that the schism between Catholics and Orthodox was largely for political circumstances. So I just want to point that one out. And there's all kinds of things that has taken place in the formation of Eastern Orthodoxy that was more political than it was theological. So I just want to throw that one out. But I did find it interesting. It says genuine desire for the unity of the church cannot be excluded from consideration. I don't know if that's a positive or if that's a backhanded, slap, or like I don't know how to take that. Genuine desire for unity of the church can't be excluded from consideration, but it's not abundantly apparent, either. So what are you saying? Are you saying that the Eastern churches, we can't really say why they were formed? We can't rule out that maybe it was for a desire for unity in the church, but, we can't exclude it. We can't rule that out, but we're not really keen on that view. I just thought, okay, that's such an insult to the Eastern Catholic churches. I don't think that the Catholic side was meant that in a derogatory way. but I kind of see it as derogatory and an insult. And again, if that's true, if that's a valid criticism of some of the Eastern churches, the way that some of the Eastern Catholic churches were formed, it's also a criticism that can be offered against the Eastern Orthodox, and their and in the way they have integrated some Catholic churches into their jurisdictions. He said, it says religious and political factors frequently intertwined. But also keep that in mind with the Eastern Orthodox churches as a whole. We could say the same of them. We could, frankly, I would argue, as a Catholic, I would argue that though there are mistakes on both sides, I would say ultimately the Orthodox side was at fault for the separation. Though there were mistakes on both sides, I would ultimately argue the Orthodox were at fault, and it was in part due to political factors. So this is a two-way street, and unfortunately, you don't get that other way of the street being mentioned here. Let's see. Let's go to paragraph 3.2. Pope Pius's encyclical letter emphasized that the supreme authority of the Roman Pontiffs was always recognized in the East and called the Orthodox to return to the communion of the See of St. Peter. The Orthodox patriarchs of Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem reacted and issued their patriarchal and synodical letter of 1848, in which, among other issues, they argued against papal supremacy. Now, I would point out, though that is true, yes, they did argue against papal primacy, or supremacy, as they call it. I'm not sure that this is a win for the Orthodox either. If I recall correctly, it had some pretty wild things to say about the Filioque that are not true theologically and historically. They certainly don't look good for the Orthodox, if I recall correctly. But I would also point out, again, I'm not sure that this was a good look for the Orthodox, this document, because it seems to say some things about even St. Peter and his primacy among the apostles that could be interpreted, in a way that doesn't help the Orthodox side. Let me give you an example from my notes here. Here's a quote from 1848. Again, this is the Orthodox. But our divine fathers, the church fathers, with one accord teach that the sense of the thrice repeated command, feed my sheep, from the Gospel of Luke, implied no prerogative in St. Peter over the other apostles, least of all in his successors. Now, I guess I could read this in multiple ways. I suppose I could read this as just simply saying that the passage from Luke implies that there was no leadership of Peter over the apostles and leadership of the successor of Peter over the successors of the other apostles. That is the Pope over the rest of the bishops. I suppose I could read it that way. It's only saying, well, only Luke doesn't testify to that primacy of St. Peter and his successors. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the context. Because I doubt very seriously that they would admit that, okay, well, Matthew 16 does, but just Luke doesn't. But Matthew 16 does. Okay, well, if Matthew 16 does, that kind of hurts your case. So I'm not sure that would help. So I honestly think what they're intending to communicate here is that there wasn't a primacy of Peter over the other apostles, let alone in his successors. That's a serious error if that's the correct interpretation. That would be a serious theological and historical error. So I'm not so sure it's a good look for the Orthodox bishops to even bring this up. Seems like it's better to just kind of forget this document because it has some pretty bad major blunders in it. Of course, Peter had a primacy among the other apostles, and that's thoroughly in the Orthodox tradition, in the Eastern tradition. And even the Bishop of Rome has a primacy over the other bishops. Again, that is also attested to by the Orthodox. And at Ephesus, Chalcedon, Constantinople III, Nicaea II, the Formula Permistus. So I don't know how to read that in any way that this helps the case of the Orthodox. It seems to hurt their case. So, in other words, if they can be in error so badly about Petrine ecclesiology and Peter's role among the apostles, couldn't they also be in equally grave error about the successor of St. Peter? If they're not getting Peter right, is it also not possible to then say they probably got the successor of Peter wrong too? I'm not sure how it helps the Orthodox bring up the case that 1848 responded to the Pope and said, we're rejecting your offer. Upon what basis? And it seems like if there's these kind of errors in it, again, isn't 1848 also the one that called the Filioque satanic or something like that? Let me see. Might be confusing it with a different one of the documents, but let's see. Is it the 1890? Was there 1895 document maybe, or yeah, it maybe was Constantinople's document. I think it was 18 something. Let's see. I'll be able to find it in time. It was one of these documents. Is it the encyclical of 1895? Let's see. Yeah, I think it was. Okay, it doesn't use the word satanic, but it does use some very strong language against the Filioque. I think it calls it heresy. Heretical. Find it. Yeah, I'll have to look more into that one. I think it was 1895 and not the 1848. But either way, the point still stands. 1848 seems to have this major blunder about the leadership of St. Peter. And if it is mistaken on that issue, it stands to reason that it could very well also be mistaken in its understanding of papal primacy and the successor of Peter. That's the overall point. Let me now go to 3.4. Oh, this was a very interesting one. In the 19th century, the Orthodox Church was confronted with an exacerbation of nationalism, and even with the intervention of integrating this into the structure of the church as an organism. The Great Council held in Constantinople in 1872 condemned ethnophilitism on the occasion of the Bulgarian Schism. At the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, national emancipation movements led to the formation of nation-states in the Balkans. In order to express and foster the Eucharistic unity of the church in this new situation, the ecumenical patriarchate granted a tomos of Autocephaly to the churches of Greece, Serbia, and Romania, according to the canonical tradition. And these churches were included in the diptychs. Now, Maybe I'm misreading this. Maybe it's just something peculiar to me. Maybe I'm misunderstanding this. That's certainly possible. But I kind of read that as a slap in the face to Russia. Because the Russian Patriarchate seems to currently be arguing the opposite. And so this is by no means accepted in Orthodoxy universally, because, again, the Patriarch of Constantinople is significantly contesting this claim. That is, that the Patriarch of Constantinople has the ability to grant a tomos of autocephaly by his own initiative, without the consent of the other patriarchal sees. It seems, if I recall correctly, like Russia is saying, no, Constantinople has to have the consent of the other sees to grant this autocephaly. Whereas Constantinople has been saying, no, I have that, or the Patriarchate of Constantinople has that authority to grant autocephaly to other churches without the consent of other synods and other patriarchs. And that this is because of a canonical tradition that allows Constantinople to do so. So Constantinople says it's acting in accord with the canons by doing so. Russia is saying you're violating the canons and you're trying to be a new pope in Orthodoxy. And you don't have this canonical tradition. You don't have the canonical right. And therefore, the church in Ukraine that was granted a tomos, Russia is going to say, no, you can't do that. So there's a huge debate taking place between Russia and Constantinople on this very question. Now, somebody pointed out that Russia didn't participate. That may be true. But they did throw this one in there, which I found to be interesting. Seems like a slap in the face to their, brother Orthodox, some of their brother Orthodox. And I'll point out, this is by no means taken for granted in Orthodoxy, but it's presented in a way that this is just matter of fact in Orthodoxy, when in reality, this is highly contested. Now, some might argue, well, it shouldn't be highly contested. It's a slam dunk for Constantinople. And others might argue, no, it's a slam dunk for Russia. There's a huge debate there, but I will point out that they kind of present it as if it's just a matter of fact, and there are plenty of Orthodox who would say, no, that's not a matter of fact. And that does what? Well, that points to the problem, doesn't it? That points to the problem of why we're even trying to have this discussion with the Orthodox. The Orthodox have a problem with primacy. They can't agree on what primacy means. And this is a perfect example. What is the role of the primate? What is the role of the protos, or the first? Does he have this kind of canonical authority? The Orthodox haven't been able to settle that, and thus they're in desperate need of the papacy. Let me go to the next part here. Paragraph 3.5 talks about how Vatican I was kind of imbalanced because of the Franco-Prussian War that came out, and so its document on the bishops was going to be coming out, but the war broke out, and so that it couldn't issue its document on the bishops, which would have balanced out its document on the Pope and Pastor Aeternus. I will point out, however, that Pastor Aeternus does have a clause there about the College of Bishops, and it does recognize the role of the bishops that I think is often overlooked in these discussions. I wouldn't portray Pastor Aeternus from Vatican I as just being so lopsided, so one-sided to the papacy, because no, it actually does have enough safeguards in there to safeguard the College of Bishops and the episcopate, and the local bishop. That is there. But might we say, but it would be good if there's a whole document further expounding on that? Yeah, absolutely, sure. Of course. And, it's partly what Vatican II ended up doing. But that was originally the intention of Vatican I, but war broke out. Let me read this part to you from paragraph 3.6. Although Pastor Aeternus taught that the Pope has ordinary and immediate episcopal jurisdiction over the Church as a whole, it nevertheless stressed that the power of each bishop is asserted, confirmed, and vindicated by the Pope, and affirmed that the Church's bond of unity is one communion and of one profession of the same faith, which is kind of backing up what I just got done telling you. But it goes on to say this. Moreover, the subsequent declaration of the German bishops in 1875, so that would have been after Pastor Aeternus, which was solemnly approved by Pope Pius IX, insisted, against certain interpretations of the council teaching, that the papacy and the episcopate are both of divine institution. Now, this is kind of another one of those not phrased in the best way. It's not absolutely wrong, but it's not phrased in the best way. Because what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say that the concept of the papacy as a divine institution is more something from 1875 and Pope Pius IX? Is that what's trying to be communicated here? It doesn't explicitly say that, and it can be read in multiple ways, but I could certainly see some people getting that impression that it's saying that. And if that's true, then that's patently false. Because the concept of it being a divine institution goes back again to Ephesus, Chalcedon, the formula of Hermistus, the Constantinople III, and you would also be able to argue same for Nicaea II. So it's rooted, well rooted within our mutual ecumenical councils, which is often overlooked. Now, again, in fairness to them, they're talking about the second millennium, not the first. I understand that. But when we're talking about the second millennium, we don't need to talk about it in such a way that we will give the people impression that something is new to the second millennium when in fact it's rooted in the first. That's my point. Let's go to 3.8, exact same point. Vatican I reinforced the prevalent tendency in Western ecclesiology following Lateran IV, which held that the universal church had priority over the local churches and possessed its own structure above the latter. Wait. Is it absolutely saying that the notion that the papacy has priority over the local churches and possesses its own structure above the latter is simply from Lateran IV and nothing prior to that? Is it actually coming out and saying that? No. But it's the same problem again, because some people get that impression. Yeah. Are they talking about the first millennium? No. But are they talking about the second millennium in such a way that could be misleading about what is present in the first millennium? Yes. That's my point. Why phrase it like that? It makes it seem as if they're saying, Lateran IV is kind of what came up with this concept of the universal church having priority over local churches. No. What? This is well rooted again in the first millennium, again in our ecumenical councils, in our tradition with the saints, both East and West. So some of these paragraphs just kind of left me scratching my head, like, what was your point with this paragraph other than seemingly to give this impression that this is something that originated in the second millennium when it didn't? It seems very poorly written in such areas. And again, if that is the intention, if the intention is to say that this came up, this kind of came about from Lateran IV, I would say I think they really need to work on their knowledge of church history. Now, surely that's not the case. Surely they're well aware of the data from the first millennium. So surely that isn't it. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, maybe this is just written very poorly. Okay. Maybe they're well aware of church history and that's not what they're saying. Okay. But it's written very poorly and in a misleading way because some people could get this impression. Could they not? I would argue yes. So whoever wrote this wrote it at the very least in a very poor way. And perhaps some of the people here didn't have a great grasp on church history. I believe it has to be the former. Surely it's not the latter. Surely these are top class theologians who know the information from the first millennium. So it can't be that. It has to be that somebody just wrote this in such a way that, both sides could sign off on this. Let me go to the next part here. Let's go to 310. Vatican I's teaching on papal primacy of jurisdiction over the whole church of papal infallibility was considered unacceptable by the Orthodox Church. That's the point, isn't it? That's the point. What Vatican I is teaching is rooted in the ecumenical councils and the formula of remisnus. So if you're going to reject Vatican I argue you're rejecting the ecumenical councils as well. That's a serious problem because I want the Orthodox to be faithful to their own tradition and faithful to the ecumenical councils. But if you're rejecting Vatican I don't think you're being faithful to your own tradition in the East. I don't think you're being faithful to the ecumenical councils. Since that ecclesiology that is expressed in Vatican I is there in the ecumenical councils that we both agree on. It says such an ecclesiology is for Orthodox a serious departure from the canonical tradition of the fathers and the ecumenical councils. Wait, what? It's the ecumenical councils that backs up the ecclesiology of Vatican I, which is why Vatican I and Pastor Aeternus is quoting Ephesus and is quoting Constantinople III and Chalcedon, if I recall correctly. It's quoting the councils. Copy and paste. They copy and paste from the ecumenical councils. So Vatican I's ecclesiology is completely native, not foreign to the ecumenical councils. But here it's saying that the Orthodox have rejected the ecclesiology of Vatican I upon the basis of the ecumenical councils. That's incoherent. That's contradictory. That makes no sense. And I would submit they're in error. They're in error about their own councils. Which is why I believe if you want to be a faithful Orthodox, if you truly want to be faithful to your Orthodox tradition, then you need to be in communion with Rome. Otherwise, though you might be sincere, you're not being faithful to your own tradition, and you're not being faithful to the ecumenical councils. That's my thesis. Because it obscures the Catholicity of each church, local church, it says. Well, that's quite a statement. Are the ecumenical councils that are backing up the ecclesiology of Vatican I, are they obscuring the Catholicity of each local church? That's quite a statement. Now, obviously, they're not going to say that these things are rooted in the ecumenical councils. They're going to say the contrary is, but that's where the debate is. But frankly, it's not hard to verify Vatican I ecclesiology and the ecumenical council. It's not hard. And that's why you have Orthodox scholars who admit, yeah, it really does look like these councils are teaching Vatican I ecclesiology. It really looks like it. And they have to come up with ingenious ways to get around that and try to argue, well, it really looks like the fathers accept it, but then they go and behave this way. So clearly in their actions, they don't really believe what they just affirmed. How does that help your case? So your church fathers are hypocrites. Your conciliar fathers are hypocrites. Your conciliar fathers say one thing, do another. How does that help your case? That doesn't help their credibility. And if they act that way with their ecclesiology, why am I accepting their Christology? It's just a bad argument. It says in the wake of Vatican I, arguments deployed by the Orthodox included, among others, that the head of the whole church is not a mortal, sinful man, but the sinless and immortal God-man Christ. First of all, I would point out, that's not in the wake of Vatican I where that argument comes from. I trace that argument back to the 1200s. And it's a really bad argument. This is why Orthodox have admitted this is a really bad argument, such as Father Schmemann or Monasuchus, I think is how you say his name. He's another one. Father John Pantaleimon Monasuchus with the ecumenical patriarchate. He's admitted this is a really bad argument. Here's why, as they'll tell you. If you want to say that no mortal man is head of the church, Jesus is head of the church, you can say the same thing about the local church, and thus you've eliminated the entire episcopate. Because all you have to do is say, Jesus is the head of the local church, not a mortal man, and now we're Presbyterians. There you go. We're Presbyterians now. We don't hold to an episcopate. It's a dumb argument. It's one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard in my life. I'm not saying people who employ it are dumb. The argument itself is pretty dumb, though. The people who employ it haven't thought through the dumb argument that they're employing, however. And so they're very short-sighted. Because if they thought through it for half a second, they would realize, wait, that comes back to bite me in my own local ecclesiology where I hold to an episcopate. So if I were consistent, I would be Presbyterian, which oddly enough, you'll find Orthodox who will say that the episcopate is not actually part of the constitution of the church. It's not actually part of the deposit of faith. It was more a post-apostolic invention. And the Orthodox who argue that, I kind of honestly have to ask, why are you not Presbyterian if you really believe that? Like, isn't that what aren't the Presbyterians right? Or, I don't know. Okay. Not a mortal man, a sinful man, but the sinless and immortal God-man Christ is the head of the church. Not only is that a very dumb argument, it's also contrary to Chalcedon, that explicitly calls the Pope the head of the church. It's contrary to Nicaea II as well. So you can't be faithful to your own ecumenical councils and uphold that silly argument. And here's my advice. It's time to bury that argument. For all the Orthodox, it's time to bury that one. You might have other arguments out there, but this is not one. It's time to bury this one. In the same way that the Protestants need to bury the argument that if you are praying to the saints, you're denying that Jesus is the one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. Stop. The Protestants need to retire that argument. It needs to be put out of commission. That thing has died a million deaths, a million times over. It's been destroyed. It's been nuked. It's been napalmed. It's a terrible argument. It's hypocritical. It's short-sighted. It's ridiculous. It has been destroyed a million times over. It's time to retire that one. Well, it's the same thing for the Orthodox. It's time to go ahead and have memory eternal to this argument. Let's go ahead and have a funeral liturgy and a panakita or something. I don't know. Let's retire this thing. It needs to go. It's just one of the worst arguments I've ever heard. And honestly, I was shocked to see it brought up here. Because you have theologians from East and West coming together with this document. And one of the dumbest arguments is brought up. Now, they're not necessarily arguing for the validity of the argument. I understand that. But they're just mentioning that, well, one of the reasons why the Orthodox rejected this is for this reason. I would say that, well, the only reason why one would even bring that up here is if they thought maybe that was a halfway decent argument. Otherwise, you just made the Orthodox look really bad because you just showed that the reason why the Orthodox rejected Vatican I was for a really, really, really dumb argument. And that doesn't make the Orthodox look good. So I have to imagine that somebody there thought this was a good argument and was worthwhile bringing up. And if that's the case, I'm just shocked that anybody of that caliber who could employ this kind of argument would be on this commission and in this dialogue. I'm just shocked. Like, whoever wrote that, if they thought that was a good argument, maybe they shouldn't be at the next one. That's my opinion. In the wake of Vatican I, arguments deployed by the Orthodox included, among others, that the head of the whole church is not a mortal, sinful man, but the sinless and immortal God-man Christ, that St. Peter himself was not a monarch nor mighty, but first among the apostles, that the jurisdiction of each patriarch is geographically determined by the sacred canons, and that none has jurisdiction over the church as a whole. This is also contrary to what the East has accepted, because the East has accepted, again, at some of the ecumenical councils and also the Formula Vermisdus, that it is not simply by the sacred canons that Rome has a primacy, but because of a divine institution. That's the problem for the Orthodox. And that's where I want to see some engagement. I want to see the Orthodox engage Ephesus, Chalcedon, Vermisdus, Constantinople III, and Nicaea II in more of the superficial way that they've done through internet apologists. I want to see a real thorough engagement of those areas. On the specific matter of infallibility, the Orthodox Church also considered that infallibility belongs to the church as a whole, as expressed by councils received by the entire people of God. As expressed by councils received by the entire people of God. That's written in such a way that it kind of points to one of the problems with Orthodoxy, and that is there's a major debate in Orthodoxy on whether or not ecumenical councils are actually in and of themselves infallible. Or if the infallibility is more from everybody receiving what the council taught. But in and of itself, the council wasn't infallible and wasn't able to bind and coerce consciences. But it was more the reception of that council that is infallible. It sounds like they're taking that latter position, that the councils in and of themselves are not infallible. It's more their universal reception that is infallible. And if that is the case, I think we have some massive problems. Because when I look at the councils of the first millennium, they don't behave in that way. They see themselves as infallible. They don't see themselves as, well, we're just going to present this perspective and we're going to wait and see if everybody receives it, and then we'll know if it's infallible. That's not the way they were operating or behaving or describing themselves. Certainly not the Sixth Ecumenical Council, where Agatho, writing to the emperor, speaks of the indefectibility of the teaching office of the Church of Rome, aka papal infallibility, and that's accepted by the bishops there at the council. So the council itself sure thought that the Pope could infallibly teach. Leo certainly thought that he could teach infallibly. All right. So again, if a Pope can, certainly an ecumenical council could as well. All right. Let's go to paragraph 4.6. Let me see. We're at an hour and a half. Let me take a quick break here, and we'll meet back and wrap it up here. I think I only have about one more page of notes or so. So yeah, give me just one moment here. So Reason and Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from RNT, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help RNT Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to RNT at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support RNT in the show description. God bless. All right. So let's continue here. Let me share my screen. Okay. Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras convoked pan-Orthodox conferences that established the agenda of the Holy and Great Council. A series of preconciliar conferences was held at Chambéry to prepare their related documents. In this context, force and access of the primates of the autocephalous Orthodox churches led to the convocation of the Holy and Great Council by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, with the unanimous consent of the primates of the Orthodox churches in Crete from 19th to 27th of June 2016. I may have been misreading this. It could certainly be me just misinterpreting this. But I almost read this in a way that it's saying that the Council of Crete was unanimously accepted by the primates of the Orthodox churches. Maybe I'm misreading that, with the unanimous consent of the primates of the Orthodox churches in Crete. So in other words, maybe it could just mean like the ones who were present at Crete, but not necessarily the ones who weren't present. Maybe that's what it meant. Surely it's not referring to the primates who weren't present, because obviously they rejected the Holy and Great Council in Crete in 2016. So it's got to mean like the unanimous consent of the primates who were actually at Crete rather than all of them. Maybe. It says the gathering of the Holy and Great Council shows that the Orthodox Church expresses her unity and Catholicity in council, conciliarity, i.e. synodality, pervades her organization, the way decisions are taken, and determines her path. Here's my problem with that. Again, given the best possible interpretation I can come up with here. Here's my problem with this. First of all, it took, 100 years? 100 years for them to, since 1930? I think they had to plan this one. Maybe even earlier than that. They had to plan this Holy and Great Council in 2016. Took about 100 years to do, and it came and went, and nothing happened. It's like a major belly flop. It was just one of the most insignificant councils possible. It did absolutely nothing. The most important questions that needed to be resolved in Orthodoxy were not resolved. Many important figures in Orthodoxy did not participate, and thus it did not get that backing that it needed. So again, it was just a major belly flop. Constantinople continues to assert that this thing is authoritative. And I think I've even heard some from the Patriarchate call it ecumenical, by the way. But they've certainly considered it authoritative, and whereas others are saying no. Now, here's the problem. It says this council shows that the Orthodox expresses herself in unity and Catholicity in council. Maybe not the best council to point to prove that. I mean, yeah, it does kind of show that the Orthodox are inclined to synodality and working together. But isn't this the very council that quite a few patriarchs and others wouldn't participate in and didn't come to? Didn't this show that there's a great deal of disunity and division in Orthodoxy? I'm not so sure that this really expressed her unity when it couldn't even get its basic primates together, let alone could they agree on anything. Some very important figures. I mean, obviously, the Patriarchate of Moscow being one among others. How does that 2016 show the unity of Orthodoxy? I think it rather shows the problems of Orthodoxy, that it can't come together on a universal level because it lacks the Bishop of Rome. I think this is a perfect illustration of their failures, but it almost is written in a way to show a great accomplishment of her unity and Catholicity in council. No. This is the worst possible example that you could give, in my opinion. This is the very one that, in my opinion, shows their desperate need for the Catholic Church. Okay, let's continue. 4.7. Yeah, that one just kind of highlights the fact that Vatican II brought a greater balance between popes and bishops, that is, College of Bishops. Yeah, sure. I can get on board with that, absolutely. Vatican II reasserted papal infallibility. I found that part interesting. Let me go to that part of the paragraph. Let's see here. Let me find the specific part. There it is. All right. Among other ecclesiological matters, the Second Vatican Council treated the question of how the episcopate is understood and how it is related to the papal ministry, which had remained open at Vatican I. Vatican II integrated and completed the teaching of Vatican I that the Pope had supreme and full authority over the church, and that in certain circumstances he could infallibly proclaim the faith of the church by saying that the body of bishops, that is, college of bishops in union with its head, the Pope, also exercises both of these prerogatives. A greater balance was thus established between the bishops and the Pope. The council reaffirmed the responsibility of bishops, not just to their own local churches, but for the church as a whole. And it particularly highlighted the significance of an ecumenical council with the bishops act together with the Pope as teachers and judges of faith and morals for the universal church. In 1965, okay, well, hold on, let me stop there. All right. It admits that Vatican II reaffirmed the supremacy and papal infallibility of the Pope, but it also just helped balance it out with an emphasis also on the College of Bishops so that there's not an overemphasis on the papacy. And that's true. And I think that that's good. And that's a wonderful contribution of Vatican II. I'm on board with that. I think that that's accurate. But I will point out again, the document itself is indicating that Vatican II reaffirmed papal supremacy and papal infallibility. Why is that important? Well, because it's showing that they're not under the impression that somehow at least the Catholic side is not under the impression and is not being presented as if it is renouncing the infallible teachings or the authoritative teachings of ecumenical councils post-schism. So you can't read the document in any way that would suggest that it's trying to downgrade ecumenical councils in the Catholic perspective. Now, I'm not saying the Orthodox admit any of this. I'm not saying the Orthodox accept Vatican I or Vatican II because of this paragraph. I think that they're just accepting that this is how Catholics understand Vatican I and Vatican II. And yeah, that's true. But that, again, proves it's not suggesting that ecumenical councils need to be downgraded or that the papacy is merely a primacy of honor. Why is that important? Because I actually had somebody contact me. A lot of people contacted me about the document and asked for my commentary on it. And one person contacted me and said, I've heard that the document argues for a primacy of honor for the Bishop of Rome. And I was like, I doubt it. But it's like, okay, let me actually read the document before I comment on it, though, which I already had plans to read. I've been pretty busy. But I finally got to it. And I read through it and I thought, no, that's not the case. It doesn't ever downgrade the papacy to a mere primacy of honor. In fact, it reasserts for the Catholic position over and over papal supremacy and papal infallibility. And here's another example. Did the Orthodox accept that? No. So did we really make any headway with this? Not really. Not anything substantial that we haven't already done already. So the Orthodox didn't accept it. And that's really where the debate needs to be. But the Catholic side didn't abandon its own ecclesiology. That's why I said at the very beginning of this video, neither side abandoned its own ecclesiology. So if you hear people saying, the Catholic side abandoned the faith, abandoned its ecclesiology, just stop. No, it didn't. Let's see here. Pope Paul VI instituted a synod of bishops as a permanent council of bishops for the universal church, representative of the whole Catholic episcopate, which would assist the Pope in an advisory and consultative capacity. Yeah. And, I might add to this that I kind of think that Pope Paul VI's move here with the synod of bishops is in the right direction, but it's still not really what synodality actually is historically in Catholicism. It's kind of a new version of synodality. I think we need to get back to better and more thorough version of synodality, which is more authentic. And that would be with local and regional and national councils and so on. Now, some might argue, well, you kind of have that with the Episcopal conferences, but no, not really. No, there are some fundamental distinctions between them. And it would be helpful to get back to some synodality on the local level, but never apart from or over and against the universal magisterium or the papacy. Never, but always in conjunction with and in harmony with the papacy. But I mean, yeah, it's a little helpful that Paul VI kind of moved in that direction of, well, let's start to have this version of synodality in the Catholic Church, even though it's not the most authentic expression of it. It's a step in the right direction. The Synod of Bishops. Let's go to 4.8. Here, there's a reference to sister churches being used as a term used by Patriarch Athenagoras and Paul VI when they lifted the excommunications, or I'm sorry, the anathemas of 1054. The use of the term sister churches, it doesn't go into that here, but I just will point out that, yeah, we do use that term, but it's sometimes misunderstood. And I have done videos on this where I talk about the actual documents of the church where the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or now the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, has clarified what the term sister church means. It doesn't mean like branch theory, or it doesn't mean that somehow the Catholics lack the fullness of the faith or the fullness of the church, or that there is more than one church that Christ established or something like that. It doesn't mean any of that. That's not what sister churches mean. Sister churches is a reference to the church considered on the local level. So we might think of it in the sense of patriarchal churches, the patriarchal church of the West and the patriarchal churches of the East. We can refer to sister churches in that realm, in that way, but it kind of sidesteps the question of, all right, but is there also a universal church, and what does that look like, and how does that work? It just kind of sidesteps the issue. So sister churches, by mentioning that's not a denial of Catholic ecclesiology. Again, we've just long recognized this as we're just referring to on the patriarchal or local level. Let's then go to wrapping it up here. Let's go to 4.10. 4.9 kind of talks about John Paul II looking for a way. Let me read that one to you. In 1995, John Paul II said, if those who want to be first are called to become the servant of all, then the primacy of love will be seen to grow from the courage of this charity. I pray the Lord to inspire, first of all, in myself and in the bishops of the Catholic Church, concrete actions as a witness to this inner certitude. He also expressed a readiness to find a way of exercising the primacy, while in no way renouncing what is central to its mission. Listen to that. Listen to that. Because again, it just further substantiates my point that the Catholic side didn't abandon its ecclesiology here. It's reasserted once again that, John Paul II's objective here was to hold to what is essential to the papacy, but can we find ways to do that, hold to what's essential to the papacy, but exercise that primacy in a way that is not repugnant to the Orthodox? Yeah. It says, is nonetheless open to a new situation, and he proposed a discussion, particularly between Roman Catholic and Orthodox bishops and theologians, on the exercise of the primacy, that we may seek together, of course, the forms in which this ministry may accomplish a service of love recognized by all concerned. Pope Benedict and Francis have regularly repeated this invitation and have both invoked St. Ignatius of Antioch's description of the Church of Rome as presiding in love. I think it's a good thing. I think it's fine to say, hey, is there a way that the Pope can, while not renouncing his mission and his ministry and its essentials, is there a way that he can exercise that mission in primacy in a way that is not absolutely repugnant to the Orthodox? Is there a way? It's a legitimate question to ask. It's worth exploring. We can't abandon our essentials. We can't do that. But is there a way that we can recognize our essentials and then exercise that ministry of primacy in a way that is compatible with Orthodox? Maybe the answer ultimately to that is no. Maybe the answer is no. And in that case, that means that Orthodox are going to have to get on board to one extent or another. And then again, maybe the answer is yes. Maybe there's a way to do this without denying and undermining in any way the papal ministry. But maybe there's a way the papal ministry can serve and function to help the Orthodox in a way that's not repugnant to them. Maybe. That's ultimately what we need to be exploring. But once again, it just goes to kind of show that the Catholics aren't here denying what's essential to the mission of the papacy. Paragraph 4.10 just kind of mentions that synodality is being promoted by Catholicism more and more, especially by Pope Francis, who says, in the dialogue with our Orthodox brothers and sisters, we Catholics have the opportunity to learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and their experience of synodality. And I would say amen to that. And I would say account for that in the way you speak of the Synod of Bishops, because the experience of synodality in the East and the historical experience of synodality isn't matching up entirely with the Synod of Bishops and the way it operates. That doesn't mean it's bad. It doesn't mean it's not helpful. It just means that we need to be cognizant of that and not conflate how the Synod of Bishops works and confuse that with synodality in the East or synodality historically. We just don't need to confuse those. I'll also point out here in the conclusion, 5.1, because it has a small conclusion section here. Yeah, there was a curious quote here. And again, it just kind of safeguards against the idea that, both sides are being unfaithful to their own tradition. It says, similarly, it is clear that for Roman Catholics, synodality is not merely consultative. And that's true. And for Orthodox primacy is not merely honorific, which, okay, it's a decent admission on part of the Orthodox. I mean, gosh, there's not a whole lot of admission on part of the Orthodox. And there generally never is in these documents, unfortunately. I think they need to do a better job at offering more concessions. But it's a start. For Orthodox primacy is not merely honorific. And I would say, okay, amen to that. Amen to that. This primacy of honor ridiculousness that we hear about from the Orthodox, that the Pope just had a primacy of honor, is just a historical fiction. That is not the way the protos functioned in the first millennium in quite a few instances. Even with the ecumenical councils, it wasn't merely honorific. It actually had teeth. It actually had power behind it. It actually had authority. It had an ability to bind consciences, to coerce consciences. That's not merely honorific. And so, okay, there's an admission. This primacy of honor, it's not merely honorific. Great. That's more than you'll get from most Orthodox. They're generally just going to talk about a primacy of honor. That's it. Okay, wonderful. Orthodox primacy is not merely honorific. But here's my problem. Then what is it? Because all I hear from the Orthodox is what they don't believe. But I never hear what they fully do believe. And you know why that is the case? I think because they lack the very one who does have the primacy, and that is the Pope. Because they can't get together to determine what they really do believe. All they can do is say, well, we don't believe that, in reaction to Catholicism or Protestantism. But they can't really come together and say, well, here's what we do believe. Here's what we think primacy actually is. Now, if they've done that somewhere, please let me know. But I just haven't seen that. It seems like they can't tell you what primacy is. They can just tell you apophatically what it's not. And that's not good enough. we need to know what primacy is. So wonderful that the Orthodox primacy is not merely honorific, but all right, what is it? What kind of authority does the first have if it's more than honorific? Juridical? What kind of authority? Is it merely liturgical? That would seem to be merely honorific. So what kind of power is there power here to it? And if we talk about power, is it just merely a moral authority? And what good is a moral authority if it doesn't actually have the ability to bind consciences? It's like the Dalai Lama at that point. It's kind of meaningless. So I'd like to see more work here on part of the Orthodox. Unfortunately, you're not going to get that from the document. Paragraph 5.2. In the Orthodox Church, synodality and primacy are practiced at the pan-Orthodox level according to the canonical tradition by the holding of holy and great councils. Let me actually show that to you in the document itself. In the Orthodox Church, synodality and primacy are practiced at the pan-Orthodox level according to the canonical tradition and by the holding of holy and great councils. Now, I want to offer a critique there. Though that may be true, though the Patriarch of Constantinople kind of represents the primacy in these holy and great councils and pan-Orthodox synods, which it's kind of hard to get an Orthodox to tell you what's the difference between a pan-Orthodox synod and a holy and great council, but that's a different issue. Sure, the Patriarch of Constantinople has some kind of primacy there. One instance is he calls the council, but then a whole bunch of people may not listen to him and reject coming to it. So it's kind of like, what good is that primacy if he can't actually, coerce their conscience to come and attend? I don't know. But in the Orthodox Church, synodality and primacy are practiced at the pan-Orthodox level at a holy and great council. It seems to be saying that pan-Orthodox synods and holy and great councils are the same thing. But my problem is, what good does this primacy do if it can't even bring people there and bring about conclusions? What has the synodality of the Orthodox at, for instance, the Holy and Great Council of 2016 really done? What has it really accomplished universally for the Orthodox? So, though we may speak of synodality and primacy in the Orthodox at the pan-Orthodox level, okay, but what good has it really accomplished? It kind of seems to be empty at the end of the day. You may call it a primacy and synodality and an exercise of the two, but I'm not really seeing it doing anything at the end of the day, not in any way that binds the rest of the churches. And in that case, I kind of have to wonder what good is it, especially when it takes 100 years to call one of these things and for it to come along and do absolutely nothing and belly flop. Are we going to have to wait another 200 years for it to do something effective for the Orthodox next time? So what I'm saying is, I think there's a legitimate critique here, though we may speak of synodality and primacy in the Orthodoxy in this way. I don't think it's really effective. More importantly, I don't even think that it is faithful to Scripture or church history, because this primacy is being exercised apart from the successor of the Bishop of Rome. Because the Patriarch of Constantinople is the one who exercises the primacy here. He is not the successor of St. Peter. You already have ecumenical councils that speak of the successor of St. Peter in perpetuity, perpetually, and indefectible in nature. That's the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So the fact that the Orthodox are not in communion with that successor of St. Peter tells you they're not in communion with something essential to the church's constitution. So the primacy that they're exercising is illegitimate because it's apart from what's essential to the church's constitution, and they've already admitted it in an ecumenical council, and it's rooted in Scripture. So the primacy that they're operating with is a violation of Scripture, and is doing violence to their own ecumenical councils. Now, I know they're not going to agree with that, and they're not going to admit that, but I think that that's a legitimate critique against the Orthodox. So while we may speak of them engaging in synodality and primacy, I think it's impotent, number one. And then number two, it's illegitimate, because the primacy is being exercised by someone who does not have the primacy. And it's apart from the one who does have the primacy in perpetuity. Let's also go to, let's see, did I have any others? No, that's it. So I do have one overall note. Let me read that to you. Overall, the document changes nothing. It restates what has already been said and doesn't achieve any additional unity. Sure, it may, express some unity by the fact that we can come together and have these discussions. That's wonderful. But it doesn't really add to the unity that exists between Catholics and Orthodox. Neither does it explain how to reconcile Catholic ecclesiology with Orthodox ecclesiologies. And notice I said ecclesiologies because Orthodox do not have a consistent ecclesiology. That's why it's easier for the document to talk about Catholic ecclesiology in Vatican I and Vatican II, but they can't do that for themselves, not in any kind of substantial way, because they don't have anything that defines their ecclesiology. They don't have a Vatican I or Vatican II. So it doesn't really reconcile Catholic ecclesiology with Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology. And I'll submit that you can't reconcile Catholic ecclesiology with Eastern Orthodox ecclesiologies. You can't, and that's because you have to have the Orthodox on the same page before they can have actual unity with others. If you don't have the Orthodox on the same page, if there's a major schism in Orthodoxy right now, which there is, and if there is major foundational disagreements on ecclesiology in Orthodoxy, which there is, then how are we really going to have unity with the Orthodox? We need the Orthodox to have unity with itself first. And then we'll be in a position that we can better understand us in relation to the Orthodox, and then we can kind of see what we can give on, where's the give, where's the take. We're in a better position to evaluate those things because we actually know what we're working with. But until the Orthodox get on the same page with themselves and come up with a defined understanding of ecclesiology, I don't think we're going to have that. And so the document itself doesn't do anything to that end. And so for that reason, I kind of feel like, what's the purpose? It's nice that we can come together and have these discussions, but what did we really agree on that hasn't already been said? And did we really resolve our essential differences? No, we haven't. So neither did it explain how to reconcile Catholic ecclesiology with Orthodox ecclesiologies who currently reject the necessity for papal primacy and the truth of papal infallibility. One thing that we can say that Orthodox ecclesiologies agree on is their rejection of papal primacy and infallibility as understood by Vatican I. That's the one thing that we can say they agree on. They might not be able to tell us what the first is, but again, they can tell us what the first isn't, and they'll say Vatican I is what it isn't. You might find a few Orthodox here and there who can get on board with Vatican I, but those are few and far in between. It didn't really resolve that issue. What I was hoping for in these two documents, that is the one from the first millennium from Chieti and this one from Alexandria, is that we could really get into the nitty gritty and try to find out how can we resolve the differences that we have in ecclesiology. And neither of the documents did that. So again, I just kind of ask at the end of the day, what did this accomplish? I don't know, other than being a nice symbolic gesture. It's kind of like the lifting of the 1054 excommunications. I mean, what did that really accomplish other than being a nice symbolic gesture? The excommunication wasn't for all Orthodox. And the one from the Patriarch of Constantinople wasn't for all Catholics. So it wasn't an excommunication of all Catholics and Orthodox, these two excommunications. It was more of two individuals, or a handful of individuals. And you could even argue that the one from the Catholic end wasn't even legitimate because the Pope Pope was already dead at the time that the cardinal issued it, so therefore it actually didn't have any authority, and so it was kind of a dead letter. But it was a nice and symbolic gesture for sure. But did it really do anything to actually like resolve the schism? No. But it's a nice gesture to work in that direction. And I guess I could say the same thing about this document. It's a nice gesture where we can sit down, have discussions, and talk about a few things that we can agree with, and that is the need for primacy and synodality to go hand in hand. And that might work ultimately towards reunion, but it didn't really do much to that end. Maybe just it got us half an inch closer in a race that, or in a distance that might go an entire mile. What I want to see is us address that entire mile that's still ahead of us. But I don't think that we can do that until the Orthodox get on the same page and resolve their own problems, resolve their own internal schism, and come up with an ecclesiology amongst themselves that they can agree with at the pan-Orthodox level. And then we can have Catholics and Orthodox sit down and say, well, okay, here's what we both believe. Here's what we can do to reconcile these things. But it's like trying to pin Jello to a tree. I mean, if it's constantly moving and you can't really, there's nothing solid there to kind of pin it to. And that's what it's like having these discussions with the Orthodox. There's nothing solid to really interact with because they don't have a unified and set and determined view yet. So anyways, I hope this has been helpful. If so, let me know. Put it in the comment section there. I'd love to hear your thoughts there in the comments, but be sure to hit the like button and the subscribe button. Also, check me out at patreon.com/reason and theology if you want to support what I'm doing, and you'll get access to exclusive content here on Reason and Theology. All right, that's going to do it, y'all. I'll see you later. God bless. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information. So Reason and Theology is growing as a channel. As a result, there's been a number of increases in production costs. So if you're benefiting from R&T, I ask that you consider supporting the channel. You can help out by contributing to the Help R&T Grow fundraiser on GoFundMe. You could also consider becoming a member on Patreon at patreon.com/Reason and Theology, or become a channel member right here on YouTube. With either of these options, Patreon or a YouTube member, you'll get extra access to patron-only content. You can also donate directly to R&T at PayPal if you prefer that option. And you can find links to all of these resources and ways to support R&T in the show description. God bless. Hey, pro-lifers, I want to remind you about realestateforlife.org. If you want to support the pro-life movement at no cost to you in the process of buying a home or selling a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, check out realestateforlife.org for more information. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button. See you next time. God bless.